One of the hardest truths to fully accept in life is that your mother, the woman who was supposed to be your first home, your first safe place, is not always perfect. She is human. And as human as she is, she carries her own wounds, her own fears, her own insecurities, and her own unhealed pain. The moment you realize that her behavior, her reactions, her words, and even her absences are not about you, you begin to step into a new dimension of freedom. It is not easy because for years, decades perhaps, you may have believed that everything she did, her criticism, her harshness, her neglect, or even her overbearing care, was a reflection of your worth. You may have carried an invisible weight, a subtle voice that whispers, "If only I were better, she would love me more fully. If only I were smarter, prettier, calmer, more obedient, she would finally accept me." And yet, when you look closer, when you strip away the layers of expectation and the stories your mind has told you, you realize that her behavior has very little to do with you at all. Her reactions are shaped by her own history, by the way she was loved or not loved by her own mother, by the societal pressures she internalized, the invisible rules she followed, and the unhealed traumas she carried from childhood into adulthood. When she criticizes you harshly, it is rarely a commentary on your ability or your character. It is the echo of her own fears, the voice of the self, doubt she never managed to silence in herself. When she withholds affection, it is often not a punishment, but a reflection of the ways she learned to cope with love as a child. When she controls, overprotects, or tries to shape you according to her vision, it is not a statement about your potential, it is a mirror of her own insecurities and limitations. The challenge, of course, is that as a child you did not have the context. You experienced her as the entire world. And so you absorbed her patterns as truths. You believed that her anger was about your mistakes. You believed that her disappointment was about your failures. You believed that her praise was rare because you were somehow not enough. And so you carried those stories into adulthood, not realizing that you were carrying her story, not yours. Every emotion you felt in relation to her became tangled with your own identity, and that made it nearly impossible to separate what was yours from what was inherited. When you begin to see her behavior as her own, not a judgment of you, a profound shift happens. You stop taking the arrows she shoots personally. You stop allowing her moods to dictate your self-worth. You recognize that when she lashes out, it may have nothing to do with your choices, your personality, or your value as a person. And this recognition is not about excusing bad behavior, nor is it about denying your feelings. It is about seeing clearly. It is about stepping into the awareness that your mother is walking her own path, carrying her own burdens, and that the reflection she offers is tinted by her limitations. This perspective does not come instantly. It comes slowly through observation, reflection, and sometimes painful acknowledgement. You notice patterns, how she reacts when she is stressed, how she projects her fears onto you, how she repeats phrases or behaviors she inherited from her own upbringing. You begin to identify the times when her anger, her silence, or her judgment has nothing to do with who you are and everything to do with the state she is in internally. And once you can see it, you no longer have to live under the tyranny of her emotional projections. You no longer have to measure yourself against her fluctuating moods. You begin to reclaim the energy that was once drained by the need for approval, validation, or love on her terms. Understanding this truth also allows compassion to emerge, a subtle yet powerful force. Compassion does not mean condoning harm. It does not mean accepting abuse or neglect. It simply means seeing clearly the human being behind the behavior, understanding the depth of her struggle, and recognizing that her limitations are not a reflection of your worth. When compassion grows, the emotional burden of resentment and blame begins to lift. You can see her not as a perfect parent, but as a human being, a woman shaped by the circumstances of her life, doing her best with what she has. This does not erase pain, but it transforms it. Pain becomes information rather than identity. Pain becomes something to learn from rather than something to carry endlessly. The liberation in this realization is profound. You can finally step out of the cage of perpetual self-blame. You can release the idea that you must fix her, win her approval, or live up to an impossible standard set by someone who could never provide it. You begin to understand that your self-worth is independent of her perception, that your value is not conditional on her approval or disapproval, that your growth, your healing, and your happiness are yours to claim, not hers to grant. And in that freedom, you start to notice something even more beautiful. The way you relate to yourself changes. You become your own witness, your own nurturer, your own protector. You begin to parent yourself in ways she may not have been able to, in ways she may not have even imagined. And that is where real healing begins. One of the most profound truths in life, and one that many of us struggle to accept for decades, is that we cannot rewrite the past. No matter how much we wish we could, no matter how much pain or resentment we carry, we cannot go back and change the experiences our mother had, the choices she made, or the way she treated us. Her childhood, her traumas, her limitations, her fears, all of these shaped her actions in ways that were completely beyond our control. And yet, so much of our emotional life, so much of our pain is tied to a longing to fix what cannot be fixed. We want to rewrite her past because we want her to be different, because we want her to have been the mother we needed, because we want validation, understanding, and love on terms we deserve. But the truth is that past is set in stone. No apology, no explanation, no moment of clarity can change the fact that she grew up, lived, and acted in ways that shaped her into the person she is today. And while this truth can feel harsh, it is also liberating, because once you accept that you cannot rewrite her past, you free yourself from the impossible task of trying to change what is unchangeable. What you can do, however, is rewrite your relationship with it. You cannot undo the hurt, the neglect, the criticism, or the absence. You cannot go back and receive the mothering you needed at the time you needed it most. But you can change the story you tell yourself about it. You can change the meaning you attach to her actions. You can shift from a mindset of victimhood to a mindset of awareness, responsibility, and ultimately empowerment. This does not mean pretending the pain never happened. It does not mean denying your feelings or silencing your grief. It means seeing the past as it was, honestly, clearly, without distortion, and then choosing how to respond to it in the present. It means taking the power that was once held hostage by resentment and fear and bringing it back into your own hands. When we dwell on her past mistakes, we often confuse observation with judgment. We replay events in our minds and assign blame, sometimes endlessly, trying to make sense of what was unfair or unkind. And in doing so, we tie our emotional state to a story that is no longer in our control. The past becomes a chain that binds us, a weight that keeps us small, defensive, and reactive. But when you shift your perspective and rewrite your relationship with that past, the chain begins to loosen. You begin to see that her actions were shaped by her circumstances, not by a desire to hurt you. You begin to notice patterns rather than isolated failures, tendencies rather than intentional cruelty. You start to distinguish between her limitations and your worth. This distinction is crucial because until you make it, you carry the pain of her history as if it were your own. Rewriting your relationship with the past is also about reclaiming narrative authority. For years, you may have lived under the implicit script written by her behavior, the script that told you, you are not enough, you must earn love, you must avoid making mistakes, you must adapt yourself to survive her moods. And for many, this script is internalized so deeply that it continues to dictate behavior even in adulthood. But awareness allows you to step outside of that story. You can see the lines she wrote, acknowledge them, and then choose whether to continue performing them or to write your own. You can choose your own narrative, one where your worth is inherent, where your mistakes do not define you, where your emotional state is your own responsibility. This is the essence of empowerment, realizing that while you cannot control the past, you can control your present response, and that response reshapes the way the past influences your life. Part of this process is also understanding the limits of resentment. Resentment keeps the past alive in your mind, replaying it like a film you cannot pause. Every criticism, every neglectful act, every harsh word becomes a fresh wound because you are constantly feeding it with attention and emotion. When you rewrite your relationship with her past, you no longer feed those old wounds with energy. You acknowledge them, you honor the pain, and then you step back. You see it as history, not prophecy. You see it as information, not identity. You recognize that her past shapes her, but it does not have to define you. And in doing so, you reclaim the emotional energy that was once tied up in frustration, anger, or sadness, and you redirect it toward growth, healing, and self-care. Another critical element in rewriting your relationship with the past is compassion, both for yourself and for her. For yourself, compassion means acknowledging that you were affected by her behavior, that the hurt was real, and that your feelings are valid. For her, compassion means recognizing that she acted according to the limitations she carried, often unconsciously repeating patterns from her own upbringing and doing the best she could with the tools she had. Compassion does not excuse harmful behavior, but it allows the mind to release the grip of blame that keeps you tethered to old pain. Compassion softens the narrative, allowing space for understanding, which in turn allows space for healing. Finally, rewriting your relationship with her past is about transformation. It is about taking what once caused suffering and using it as a doorway to self-realization. It is about recognizing that the mothering you did not receive externally can be cultivated internally. It is about creating boundaries, nurturing yourself, and developing the emotional resilience that allows you to interact with her, not from a place of need, fear, or resentment, but from a place of clarity, strength, and choice. When you begin this process, the past no longer controls your present. It becomes a teacher rather than a jailer. It informs you, guides you, and ultimately strengthens your capacity for love, empathy, and self-respect. The mother wound is one of the most subtle and insidious forces in our emotional life. Unlike obvious trauma or conflict, it often works silently, invisibly shaping patterns of thought, behavior, and emotion without our conscious awareness. It is carried not only in memory but in instinct, in the way we move through the world, in the automatic ways we respond to love, approval, and authority. For many, the wounds of a mother, the neglect, the criticism, the conditional love, the absence, or even the overbearing control become internalized as rules about how life should be approached, how relationships should be navigated, and how the self should be valued. These patterns often manifest long after childhood ends, coloring adult choices, emotions, and interactions in ways that feel inevitable or natural, even when they are rooted in pain. Understanding the depth of this influence is crucial, because until these unconscious patterns are recognized, healed, or transformed, true freedom remains elusive. The mother wound often operates as a blueprint for relational behavior. If you were raised in an environment where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned through compliance, achievement, or perfection, you may carry an unconscious belief that love is transactional. You may find yourself constantly striving, performing, or overachieving in your relationships, hoping that this time, things will be different. Even when you are in a healthy partnership, you might notice a subtle tension, a persistent fear of rejection, a need to anticipate the moods of others, a compulsion to earn affection through effort rather than simply being. These patterns are not random. They are echoes of the way you were raised, internalized at a level deeper than conscious thought, guiding your actions without permission, whispering that you are never quite enough, never quite worthy, never fully seen. Another manifestation of the mother wound is the repetition of unhealthy relational dynamics. Often, without realizing it, individuals unconsciously seek out partners, friends, or environments that mirror their early maternal experiences. If love was unpredictable, you may find yourself drawn to instability. If criticism was constant, you may unconsciously choose relationships that validate that same voice of judgment. If neglect was present, you may tolerate distance, indifference, or emotional unavailability in others because it feels familiar. The patterns repeat because they are familiar, not because they are right. The mind and heart are drawn to what is known, even when it causes pain, and this unconscious repetition is a testament to how deeply the mother wound embeds itself into the psyche. Until these patterns are brought into awareness, the cycle continues, leaving the individual trapped in experiences that reinforce the very beliefs they long to escape. The mother wound also shapes self-perception in profound ways. Criticism, lack of validation, or inconsistent nurturing in childhood often creates an internal critic that is relentless. It whispers doubts and insecurities at every turn, casting shadows over achievements, diminishing joy and amplifying shame. Even in adulthood, a person may hear that voice echoing in moments of hesitation, failure, or vulnerability, telling them that they are not enough. These internalized messages operate below conscious awareness, yet they influence every choice, every relationship, every interaction with the world. They shape how you speak to yourself, how you protect yourself, and how you navigate intimacy. Until the origin of this voice is recognized, it will continue to dictate behavior, often sabotaging success, happiness, and connection without the individual realizing why. Emotional regulation is another arena deeply affected by the mother wound. Early maternal experiences teach the child how to manage or fail to manage emotions. If feelings were dismissed, shamed, or feared, the child learns to suppress them. If they were ignored, the child may internalize a sense of emotional invisibility. These lessons are carried forward, often unconsciously, shaping adult responses to anger, sadness, fear, and joy. Emotional suppression, avoidance, or hyper-reactivity often trace back to these early imprints, creating cycles where emotions are either denied, exaggerated, or misdirected. This is why people may feel trapped in emotional patterns that seem beyond their control, reacting to situations not on their merits, but as echoes of unresolved maternal influence. One of the most challenging aspects of the mother wound is its subtlety. Unlike overt abuse, which can be clearly identified and addressed, the mother wound often hides in what is considered normal. It is the quiet judgment, the unspoken expectation, the inconsistency of love, the conditional support, the emotional unavailability that leaves no explicit mark, yet profoundly shapes the psyche. Many grow up believing that these experiences are universal or deserved, unaware that they have been internalized in ways that continue to define behavior long after childhood ends. This invisibility makes healing particularly challenging because the wound is not always recognized and the patterns it creates are accepted as natural or inevitable. Yet awareness is the first step toward transformation. Bringing these patterns into consciousness allows the individual to interrogate them, to ask whether the behaviors, fears, or automatic responses are truly their own or inherited echoes of the mother wound. The process of recognizing these unconscious patterns is a process of reclaiming autonomy, of disentangling self from inherited emotional legacy. It requires patience, introspection, and often guidance because these patterns are deeply embedded and have operated for years without interruption. But with awareness comes choice. Once identified, these patterns can be challenged, reshaped, and healed. Emotional self-regulation, boundary setting, authentic expression, and self-compassion become possible. The individual begins to respond to life from the present, not from the echo of the past, and gradually the influence of the mother wound diminishes, leaving space for freedom, authenticity, and peace. Detachment is one of the most misunderstood concepts in human relationships, especially when it comes to the mother-child dynamic. For many, detachment carries a weighty, negative connotation as if stepping back or creating distance means rejecting, abandoning, or cutting off the person you love. But true detachment is not abandonment, it is clarity, presence, and self-preservation. It is the conscious choice to preserve your emotional energy, your peace of mind, and your self-worth without allowing another's unresolved pain, projections, or limitations to dictate your life. Understanding this distinction is essential because until detachment is seen as a tool for empowerment rather than a withdrawal of love, many remain trapped in cycles of responsibility, guilt, and emotional exhaustion. Many people grow up internalizing the belief that love is synonymous with sacrifice and self-erasure. If you were raised in an environment where your mother's happiness, moods, or approval were treated as your responsibility, you likely absorb the subtle instruction that your presence must always serve her, that your emotions must be secondary, and that your boundaries are optional. In such circumstances, detachment can feel frightening. The mind may whisper, "Why, if I step back, I will be a bad daughter. If I protect myself, I am cruel. If I stop trying to fix her, I am abandoning her." And yet, this is a distortion of truth. Detachment is not rejection. It is recognition. It is seeing clearly what is yours to carry and what is not, and stepping out of the invisible chains of obligation that often dominate the mother-child relationship. Detachment allows you to maintain your love without losing your sense of self. You can love someone deeply and still refuse to let their unresolved issues control your emotions, dictate your decisions, or define your worth. You can honor the bond, respect the relationship, and show care while simultaneously creating healthy distance from behaviors that harm, drain, or destabilize you. This is where detachment is profoundly different from abandonment. Abandonment implies withdrawal of care, attention, or presence out of neglect, resentment, or disconnection. Detachment, in contrast, is rooted in awareness, mindfulness, and choice. It is the conscious acknowledgement that you cannot fix, change, or heal someone else, that their journey is theirs alone, and that you are not responsible for carrying the weight of their emotional unresolvedness. Detachment is also a recognition of impermanence and limitation. As children, we often assume that our mother is all-powerful in our emotional universe. We imagine that if she is unhappy, distant, or critical, it must be because we are failing in some way. But detachment allows the truth to emerge: your mother is human. She is limited, conditioned, and carrying her own wounds. Her inability to meet your needs perfectly does not diminish your worth. It does not mean you are unlovable or inadequate. Detachment teaches you to accept reality as it is rather than as you wish it to be, and in doing so, it liberates your heart from the endless cycle of striving for approval that may never arrive. Creating this space is not easy. It often feels counterintuitive, especially when cultural, familial, or societal messages equate closeness with obedience, sacrifice, or perpetual presence. But the paradox of detachment is that stepping back emotionally often increases the clarity and quality of the connection. When you stop reacting to her moods, trying to anticipate her needs, or taking responsibility for her feelings, interactions become less charged with unconscious expectation. Conversations can happen without hidden agendas. Moments of presence are richer because they are chosen freely, not driven by guilt or fear. You can engage with your mother authentically, offering support or love without being trapped in the patterns of your past. Another important dimension of detachment is self-protection. Emotional entanglement, especially in a relationship where one party is unresolved, creates a constant drain on energy. When you are overly invested in fixing, soothing, or controlling her, your own emotional needs are often neglected. You may find yourself anxious, resentful, or exhausted without understanding why. Detachment is a protective boundary. It is the conscious choice to say, "I will honor our bond, but I will not sacrifice my peace to maintain it." This does not diminish love, it preserves it, allowing it to exist in a healthier, more sustainable form. Detachment also fosters inner stability. When you are no longer dependent on her moods, approval, or validation, your sense of self becomes anchored in your own awareness and values. You stop measuring yourself through the lens of her approval or criticism. You stop reacting automatically to triggers that once held immense power over you. Instead, you develop a quiet center, a steady presence that allows you to navigate her imperfections without being pulled into the emotional turbulence. This does not mean detachment eliminates emotional pain. It does not erase the hurt of unmet needs or past wounds, but it creates a framework in which those emotions can be experienced without consuming your identity or controlling your actions. Detachment ultimately is an act of self-love, not selfishness. It is the recognition that you cannot nurture another's growth or heal their unresolved trauma at the expense of your own well-being. It is an understanding that love is not measured by sacrifice, submission, or endless tolerance. It is measured by presence, authenticity, and boundaries. When you detach wisely, you are not abandoning your mother. You are abandoning the illusions, the guilt, and the patterns that kept you trapped. And in doing so, you create the possibility for a more conscious, balanced, and authentic relationship. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood and misapplied concepts in human relationships, especially in the context of the mother-child dynamic. Many people equate forgiveness with reconciliation, with reopening doors, with granting permission for past behaviors to continue, or with absolving the other person of responsibility. This is a dangerous misconception, because it often traps the individual in cycles of resentment under the guise of love or family loyalty. True forgiveness is not about giving her the power to continue harming you or pretending that the past did not happen. True forgiveness is about reclaiming your own freedom. It is about taking back the emotional territory that has been held hostage by pain, resentment, and expectation. It is the understanding that holding on to bitterness only chains you to her past and limits your own capacity to experience life fully. For many of us, forgiveness seems impossible because the wounds inflicted by a mother are deep, pervasive, and intertwined with identity itself. Her words, actions, or absences may have left invisible scars that echo in our choices, our relationships, and even our self-perception. Anger, disappointment, or grief toward her can feel like a justified defense, because it is. These emotions are natural and they reflect the human need for acknowledgement, safety, and love. Forgiveness does not require denying or dismissing these feelings. On the contrary, it begins with honest acknowledgement. It begins with saying to yourself, this hurt happened. It was real. I felt the pain. I was impacted. I am allowed to feel the weight of it. Only when you truly recognize the reality of the wound can forgiveness even begin. Because forgiveness is never about erasing pain. It is about releasing the hold that pain has over your present and your future. The mother wound often creates a persistent mental loop, replaying old scenarios, imagining different outcomes, and blaming yourself or her for choices made long ago. This loop can keep you trapped for years, even decades. Forgiveness interrupts the loop. It is the conscious decision to step out of the mental prison of replay and instead choose peace, regardless of whether she is capable of offering apology, understanding, or change. In this way, forgiveness is entirely internal. It is not dependent on her behavior or her acknowledgement. It is your act of liberation, not hers. You do not wait for her permission to forgive you, and you do not require a reconciliation to validate your decision to release the burden of resentment. Forgiveness also involves distinguishing between compassion and complicity. Compassion does not mean allowing harm to continue. It does not mean lowering boundaries or tolerating repeated mistreatment. It is possible and indeed essential to forgive while simultaneously protecting yourself. Forgiveness allows you to see her not only as the person who hurt you, but also as a human being shaped by limitations, conditioning, and experiences that she could not fully control. It allows you to recognize that while her actions may have been harmful, they were not necessarily malicious. They were often unconscious repetitions of her own unresolved wounds. This perspective does not excuse her behavior, but it reframes it in a way that prevents it from continuing to dominate your emotional landscape. One of the most liberating aspects of forgiveness is that it restores power to the one who forgives. While resentment and bitterness feel like righteous anger, they are, in reality, invisible chains. They bind you to her past, forcing you to relive the hurt and the sense of inadequacy repeatedly. Forgiveness cuts those chains. It allows you to reclaim your life, your emotional energy, and your self-worth. When you forgive, you no longer grant the past the ability to dictate your present state of mind. You no longer allow the echoes of old criticism, neglect, or disapproval to define who you are or how you engage with the world. Forgiveness transforms pain from a prison into a teacher, from a weight into a stepping stone, and from a wound into an opportunity for growth and self-mastery. Forgiveness also shifts your relationship with time. The mother wound often keeps us trapped in the past, replaying old scenarios and allowing them to color present experiences. Forgiveness anchors you in the present because it requires a conscious decision here and now. It is not a one-time act but a continual practice. You may need to forgive moments, words, or actions repeatedly as memories resurface. Each act of forgiveness is a reclaiming of the present, a refusal to let the past control your emotional reality. Over time, these repeated acts transform the emotional landscape of your life, creating space for joy, self-love, and authentic connection that is not shadowed by unresolved pain. Finally, understanding that forgiveness is freedom and not reconciliation allows you to engage with your mother from a place of strength rather than neediness. You no longer interact out of obligation, guilt, or the unconscious hope that she will finally give you what you were denied. You interact consciously with clarity about boundaries, with awareness of her limitations, and with the peace that comes from knowing that your emotional well-being is no longer hostage to her behavior. In this way, forgiveness becomes a radical act of self-care, a reclamation of power, and a declaration that your peace is non-negotiable. Self-mothering is the act of becoming the nurturer, protector, and guide for yourself in ways that your mother, for whatever reason, could not be. It is the conscious decision to fill the emotional gaps, unmet needs, and wounds left by maternal limitation with your own awareness, compassion, and presence. For many, this concept feels radical because it challenges the fundamental expectation that someone outside of us, our mother, should have provided everything we needed. But the truth is, life rarely offers perfect mothers, and waiting for validation, care, or understanding from an external source can keep us trapped indefinitely in cycles of disappointment and longing. Self-mothering is the restoration that begins within. It is the reclamation of your emotional autonomy and the creation of an inner sanctuary where your needs are recognized, honored, and met, At its core, self-mothering requires awareness of the ways you were wounded, neglected, or misunderstood. It is not about blaming your mother or dismissing the love she did offer. It is about observing clearly the patterns of incompleteness or imbalance and acknowledging how they have affected your life. Perhaps you grew up feeling unseen, criticized, or unsupported. Perhaps emotional expression was discouraged or love felt conditional. These experiences do not define you, but they have left impressions that shape how you move through the world. Self-mothering begins with the recognition of those wounds and the understanding that if you do not consciously nurture yourself, these gaps will continue to dictate your behavior, choices, and relationships. Once awareness is established, self-mothering moves into action. It is the deliberate cultivation of inner care. It is speaking to yourself with kindness, validating your feelings, and honoring your experiences. Where your mother may have dismissed your emotions or demanded perfection, you create an inner space that allows imperfection, vulnerability, and authenticity. You listen to yourself without judgment, providing the guidance, encouragement, and reassurance that may have been missing in childhood. You learn to comfort yourself in moments of fear, doubt, or sadness, and in doing so, you internalize a sense of safety that is independent of external validation. Self-mothering also involves the establishment of boundaries. Often, the mother wound teaches children to prioritize another's needs above their own, to tolerate discomfort, and to over-adapt in order to preserve connection. Self-mothering requires recognizing that your emotional and physical well-being is paramount. It is the courage to say no to behaviors, interactions, or relationships that harm you or deplete your energy. It is the awareness that saying no to others is not selfish, it is essential for self-preservation. By setting boundaries consciously and consistently, you reinforce the message that your needs are valid and your well-being is your responsibility. In this way, self-mothering becomes both nurturing and protective, providing care while preserving integrity. Another vital aspect of self-mothering is the cultivation of self-validation. Many individuals carry the imprint of maternal criticism or conditional love, internalizing a sense of inadequacy or unworthiness. Self-mothering requires that you interrupt this pattern by affirming your inherent value. It is the act of recognizing your achievements, acknowledging your emotions, and offering yourself the recognition you may have longed for from her. This practice is not ego-driven, it is restorative. It rewrites the internal dialogue from one of doubt and self-judgment to one of respect, love, and acceptance. Through this, you learn to rely on yourself as your primary source of emotional sustenance rather than seeking constant external reassurance. Self-mothering also teaches patience and presence. Unlike childhood, where care is often demanded or inconsistent, the act of nurturing oneself is deliberate and continuous. It requires daily attention, gentleness, and forgiveness. You learn to be present with your own experiences, to sit with discomfort without rushing, to honor the process of healing as it unfolds naturally. This patience is transformative because it replaces the unconscious habit of seeking instant repair, external approval, or quick fixes with a deeper understanding that restoration takes time and care. Over time, this consistent self-nurturing builds resilience, emotional maturity, and an inner reservoir of love that is not dependent on anyone else. In addition, self-mothering allows you to reclaim the joy and creativity that may have been stifled by unmet maternal care. When you nurture yourself, you create a safe space to explore your passions, express your desires, and engage fully with life without fear of judgment or rejection. You develop the courage to be fully seen, fully felt, and fully alive. This restoration is not merely emotional, it is existential. It reconnects you with the deepest parts of yourself that were often silenced by the limitations of maternal influence, allowing for a profound experience of wholeness and freedom. Self-mothering also transforms relationships. As you learn to nurture yourself, you stop projecting unmet needs onto others. You no longer seek external validation to fill inner voids. You engage in relationships from a place of wholeness, offering love freely rather than seeking to repair or complete yourself through others. This shift creates healthier dynamics, reduces dependency, and allows for authentic connection. Your interactions are guided by choice and presence rather than unconscious patterns inherited from maternal influence. Finally, self-mothering is the ultimate act of restoration because it closes the loop that external care could not. It is a reclaiming of power, a rewriting of internal narrative, and a declaration that your emotional life is yours to cultivate. It does not erase the past or negate the complexities of your relationship with your mother. Instead, it transforms your experience of the past into a foundation for self-sovereignty. Through self-mothering, you cultivate compassion, resilience, and love for yourself in ways that no one else can provide, creating a life anchored in authenticity, security, and freedom